In an upscale suburban dining room, a perfectly orchestrated Mother's Day brunch was about to become a battlefield. What started as a traditional family celebration took a shocking turn when they came face to face with 25 years of buried secrets. Emma Rodriguez-Morrison wasn't your typical daughter-in-law. For 6 months, she had spent her life wrestling with devastating knowledge, known for her unwavering moral compass and legal precision. When she encountered Margaret's hidden love letters while organizing retirement documents, she had no idea. She was walking into a family minefield. Emma made a choice that would lead to the complete destruction of everything the Morrison family believed about themselves. What began as a heartfelt Mother's Day toast would become a revelation that shattered 3 decades of carefully maintained lies. The Morrison household would never be the same after the truth about Michael's real father was finally exposed. The crystal glass trembled in Emma's hand as she stood before the family table, her voice steady but her heart racing. To the woman who'll soon face the consequences of choices made 25 years ago. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Chen Morrison's hands moved with practiced precision as she adjusted the peonies in the crystal vase, their soft pink petals catching the morning light that streamed through the bay windows. The dining room table stretched before her like a stage set, each piece of china positioned exactly 2 inches from the table's edge, the silverware gleaming against the cream linen tablecloth her mother had given her 30 years ago. She stepped back, surveying the scene with critical eyes. Perfect. It had to be perfect. The doorbell's chime sent a familiar flutter through her chest. 30 years of hosting Mother's Day brunch, and she still felt that moment of anticipation before the performance began. She smoothed her silk blouse, pale lavender, chosen to complement the flowers, and arranged her face into the serene smile that had become second nature. Sarah, darling. Margaret embraced her eldest daughter, accepting the bouquet of white roses with practiced grace. Sarah Morrison Blake carried herself with the efficient energy of someone juggling 2 young children and a demanding career, but Margaret caught the shadows beneath her eyes. Always trying to hold everyone together, this one. "The house looks incredible, Mom," Sarah said, her voice carrying genuine warmth. "Where should I put the children's gifts?" "On the sideboard, sweetheart. Your father's probably already boring. Someone with retirement stories." Robert's laughter drifted from the living room, rich and content. At 62, retirement had transformed him from the driven contractor who left before dawn to a man who lingered over coffee and newspaper crosswords. Margaret watched him through the archway, gesturing animatedly to their early arrivals, and felt the familiar tug of affection mixed with something darker she refused to name. James arrived next with his fiancée Lisa, both of them carrying the careful politeness of people still learning their place in family rhythms. James kissed Margaret's cheek with dutiful affection. Her middle child, the one who'd inherited Robert's methodical nature and his father's unshakable belief in doing things the right way. "Everything smells amazing, Mrs. Morrison," Lisa offered, extending a carefully wrapped gift. "James told me about your famous French toast casserole." Margaret's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. She'd made that casserole every Mother's Day for 15 years, yet it still surprised people. As if she hadn't been perfecting recipes and managing households long before she'd married into suburban American life. Michael appeared in the doorway like morning mist, his artist's sensitivity evident in how he paused to really see the room before entering. At 24, he moved with quiet grace that set him apart from his more assertive siblings. His dark hair caught the light as he bent to kiss Margaret's forehead, and her breath hitched. So much like David's had been. "Happy Mother's Day, Mom. The house looks like something from a magazine spread." His words carried affection without irony, but Margaret felt her chest constrict. Michael had always been different. More intuitive, more perceptive. Sometimes she wondered if he sensed the weight she carried, the way children could smell rain before clouds appeared. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" The maternal radar she'd honed over decades picked up his pallor, the slight tension around his eyes. "Better. The doctors want more tests next week, but nothing serious." Michael's dismissal didn't fool her. She'd watched him struggle with fatigue and strange symptoms for months, seen him grow thinner despite her efforts to feed him properly. Car doors slammed outside. Through the window, Margaret watched Emma Rodriguez-Morrison gathering gift bags from her silver BMW, movements precise, but somehow reluctant. Behind her, Grace Morrison emerged from her own vehicle, sharp eyes already, cataloging the scene with the attention of someone who'd been watching this family for decades. Margaret's stomach clenched. Emma had been different these past months, distant, watchful, studying Margaret instead of simply being part of the family. And Grace. Grace had never fully accepted her, not from the beginning. Robert's sister possessed an uncomfortable ability to see through carefully maintained facades. "Emma's here," Sarah announced, moving toward the front door with automatic efficiency. Margaret watched Emma enter, noting her lawyer's posture, the smile that didn't quite reach her dark eyes. She'd married into the family 5 years ago, bringing intelligence, ambition, and a directness that sometimes clashed with the Morrison preference for polite surfaces. "Margaret, you've outdone yourself again," Emma said, offering her cheek for the customary kiss. But her eyes scanned the room with systematic attention, like someone gathering evidence. Grace's entrance shifted the energy, the arrival of someone who remembered different versions of all their stories. She hugged Robert with genuine warmth, greeted Margaret with cordial distance, and settled into family dynamics with practiced ease. "Retirement suits you, Bobby," Grace said, using Robert's childhood nickname with deliberate intimacy. "You look 10 years younger." "I feel it." Emma's been helping organize the business papers. Amazing how much documentation 30 years creates. Robert's pride in his daughter-in-law was evident, oblivious to how Margaret's hands stilled on the serving spoon at the mention of paperwork. The family moved toward the dining room with ritual choreography. Robert took his place at the head, Margaret at the foot, children arranged by hierarchy and marriage status. Conversation flowed in familiar channels: career updates, Sarah's children's accomplishments, James's wedding plans, Michael's art projects. But Margaret found herself watching Emma, noting careful, measured responses. The way she glanced at Michael with something resembling pity. How her fingers drummed against her water glass when Robert mentioned business documents again. The family partnership paperwork was fascinating, Emma said suddenly, her voice cutting through comfortable chatter. Amazing how much history gets preserved in legal documents. Brief silence fell. Margaret felt her heartbeat accelerate, a warning rhythm that had become familiar during these months of watching Emma's increasingly pointed observations. "Well," Robert said, raising his mimosa, "before we dive into business talk, shouldn't we have our traditional toast?" Margaret watched Emma stand, glass catching morning light like a prism. The familiar ritual was about to begin. Words of gratitude, celebration of maternal bonds, reaffirmation of family love. But something in Emma's posture, in how she looked directly at Margaret while the family settled into expectant silence, made Margaret's blood turn to ice. "To the woman who'll soon," Emma began, her voice steady and clear. Margaret knew, with the terrible certainty of 30 years buried fear, that her perfect world was about to shatter beyond repair. Emma's glass trembled slightly in her hand as the words hung in the air. Margaret's world had already begun to crumble, but Emma pressed forward, her voice gaining strength with each syllable. "To the woman who'll soon face the consequences of choices made 25 years ago." The silence that followed was deafening. Robert's smile faded slowly, confusion creeping across his weathered features. Sarah's hand froze halfway to her mouth, mimosa forgotten, James leaned forward, his accountant's mind already calculating that something was terribly wrong. Margaret's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Emma, what are you—" "I found the letters, Margaret." Emma's words cut through the room like a blade. "Last month, while organizing Robert's retirement documents. Hidden in that old file box you asked me never to touch." The crystal glass slipped from Margaret's fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor. The sound seemed to wake everyone from their frozen shock. "Letters?" Robert's voice carried, the careful tone of a man trying to understand a language he'd never heard before. Emma reached into her purse, withdrawing a small bundle of yellowed envelopes tied with a faded ribbon. Margaret's eyes fixed on them with the horror of someone watching their execution. "Love letters," Emma continued, her attorney's training, keeping her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "From David Chen, your business partner, Robert, written during a 6-month period in 1999. She paused, letting the timeline sink in. The same period when Michael was conceived. The words hit the room like a physical blow. Michael's face went ashen, his artistic sensitivity making him the first to grasp the full implication. Sarah's sharp intake of breath broke the silence. "That's impossible," James said, his voice rising. "Emma, what the hell are you doing?" But Robert had gone perfectly still, his eyes moving between Emma and Margaret with the slow comprehension of a man watching his life reorganize itself into an unrecognizable pattern. "Robert, I can explain," Margaret began, reaching toward her husband. "Don't." Robert's voice was barely audible, but it stopped Margaret's hand mid-air. "Don't say another word." Emma's composure began to crack as she witnessed the devastation spreading across the table. "Michael's been having health issues, genetic markers that don't match anyone in your family, Robert. I couldn't—" Her voice broke. "I couldn't let him suffer because we were all too polite to tell the truth." Michael stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Are you saying—" His voice was hollow, distant. "Are you saying Dad isn't my father?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Margaret's carefully constructed world, 30 years of Mother's Day brunches, family photos, Christmas mornings, began collapsing around her. "Michael, sweetheart, you have to understand." Margaret's desperation leaked through her usually controlled voice. "Understand what?" James exploded, slamming his palm against the table. The fine china jumped, and Lisa recoiled beside him. "Understand that you're saying our mother is a—" "James, stop!" Sarah's voice carried the authority of someone used to managing family crises, but her face was pale with shock. Robert pushed back from the table, the legs of his chair groaning against the floor. He looked at Margaret as if seeing a stranger wearing his wife's face. "David Chen," he said quietly, "my business partner, my friend." Each word was measured, clinical. "The man I trusted with everything." Margaret's composure finally shattered. "Robert, please let me explain. The business was failing. We were fighting constantly. You were never home. So you fucked my business partner." Robert's crude language shocked the room into silence. In 30 years of marriage, his children had never heard him speak that way. "Dad," Michael started, but Robert cut him off with a look. "And you." Robert's gaze settled on his youngest son, or the young man he'd believed was his son. "You're not mine." The words hit Michael like a physical blow. He staggered slightly, gripping the back of his chair for support. Emma watched the destruction she'd unleashed, her face a mask of professional control barely containing personal anguish. "The letters detail everything. The affair lasted 6 months. Margaret ended it when she realized she was pregnant, but David suspected—" "Stop!" Margaret's scream cut through Emma's recitation. "Stop talking. This is my family, my life. You had no right. I had every right." Emma's composure finally cracked completely. Michael's health could be at risk because of medical history he doesn't have access to. Because you've been living a lie for 25 years. Grace, who had remained silent throughout the revelation, slowly set down her coffee cup. Her face showed no surprise, only the grim satisfaction of someone whose long-held suspicions had finally been confirmed. "I knew," she said quietly. "Not the details, but I knew something was wrong. The timing, the way you acted after Michael was born, the way David suddenly dissolved the partnership and moved away." Robert turned on his sister with desperate fury. "You knew? You knew and said nothing?" Grace met his gaze steadily. "I had suspicions, Bobby, not proof. And you were happy." Her voice softened. "You were so happy with your perfect family." The words "perfect family" seemed to echo mockingly. Around the destroyed brunch table, broken crystal, cold food, and shattered lives created a tableau of suburban devastation. Michael's voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. 24 years. 24 years of calling you dad, and you're not." He couldn't finish the commie sentence. Robert's face crumpled. For a moment, the angry, betrayed husband disappeared, and only the father remained. "Michael, son, don't call me that." Michael's words were soft, but devastating. "Apparently, I'm not." The rejection hit Robert like a physical blow. He looked around the table, at his wife who had betrayed him, at his sister who had suspected the truth, at his daughter-in-law who had revealed it, at the son who might not be his son. Without another word, Robert walked out of the dining room. The sound of the front door slamming echoed through the house like a gunshot. Margaret started after him, her silk blouse catching on the broken crystal as she stumbled from the table. "Robert, wait! Please, let me—" The door slammed again, cutting off her pleas. The remaining family members sat in stunned silence. The wreckage of their Mother's Day brunch spread before them like evidence of a crime. The morning sun still streamed through the windows. The peonies still bloomed in their crystal vase, but the world had fundamentally changed. Emma looked around the table at the devastation she'd created, the weight of her decision settling on her shoulders like a stone. She'd chosen truth over peace, justice over harmony. Now they would all have to live with the consequences. The silence that followed Robert's departure stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Margaret's footsteps echoed through the hallway as she pursued her husband, her voice breaking through the house like fractured glass. "Robert, please, you have to let me explain." The master bedroom door slammed shut with finality that made the remaining family members flinch. They sat frozen around the debris of their Mother's Day brunch, the elegant table now a crime scene of shattered crystal and abandoned mimosas. "This is insane," James muttered, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "This is absolutely insane." He turned to Emma, his eyes blazing. "You destroyed our family. For what? For some twisted sense of moral superiority?" Emma's face was pale but resolute. "Michael had a right to know. His health was fine until you decided to play God," James shot back, his accountant's mind grappling with the systematic destruction of everything he'd believed about his family. "You could have talked to Mom privately. You could have—" "I tried," Emma said quietly. "For months I tried. She refused to listen." Sarah finally found her voice, though it came out strained and thin. "Emma's right." The words seemed to cost her something fundamental. She looked around the table, her role as family mediator asserting itself even in chaos. If Michael's sick, if he needs medical history from a man who abandoned our family 25 years ago? James's voice cracked. A man who destroyed Dad's business and disappeared? Michael had remained silent throughout their argument, staring at his hands as if they might hold answers to questions he'd never thought to ask. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I always felt different." The simple statement, cut through their argument like a knife. Sarah reached for her youngest brother's hand, but he pulled away gently. Not bad different, Michael continued, his artist's vocabulary failing him in the face of identity crisis. Just different. Like I was watching our family from the outside sometimes. Like I didn't quite fit the pattern. Upstairs, they could hear Margaret's muffled voice through the bedroom door, pleading, explaining, breaking apart in real time. Robert's responses, if there were any, remained inaudible. Grace set down her coffee cup with deliberate precision. Your mother made her choices 25 years ago. The rest of us have been living with the consequences ever since. You knew, Sarah said. It wasn't a question. All these years, you knew something. Grace's sharp eyes moved around the table, assessing the damage with the clinical detachment of someone who'd spent decades watching other people's secrets tear families apart. I suspected. The timing was too convenient. David's sudden departure, the dissolution of the partnership, Margaret's behavior after Michael was born. But suspicion isn't proof, and your father was happy. She paused. Sometimes ignorance is a form of kindness. Kindness? Emma's voice rose. Kindness would have been telling the truth from the beginning. Kindness would have been giving Michael access to his real medical history before he got sick. And kindness would have been approaching this privately instead of destroying our family at a Mother's Day brunch, James shot back. Lisa, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke. Maybe we should all just take a breath, process this. But processing required a kind of emotional vocabulary none of them possessed. How do you process the revelation that your family's foundation was built on lies? How do you reconcile 24 years of assumed truth with the reality of betrayal? Michael stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood. I need some air. Michael, wait. Sarah reached for him again. I need to think. His voice carried a new quality, not the gentle, accommodating tone they were used to, but something harder, more decisive. I need to figure out who I am, if I'm not, if Dad isn't. He couldn't finish the sentence. The fundamental question of identity, who was Michael Morrison if Robert Morrison wasn't his father, hung in the air like smoke. Emma watched him leave, the weight of her decision settling heavier on her shoulders. She'd told herself she was protecting him, giving him the medical history he needed. But watching his world crumble, she wondered if protection and destruction were sometimes the same thing. From upstairs came the sound of a door opening, then Margaret's voice in the hallway, desperate and raw. Robert, please don't leave. We can work through this. We can... The front door opened and closed again. Through the dining room window, they watched Robert climb into his truck, his movements mechanical, distant. He didn't look back at the house as he drove away. Margaret appeared in the dining room doorway, her perfect hostess composure completely shattered. Her silk blouse was wrinkled, her carefully styled hair disheveled. She looked like someone who'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. He won't listen, she said to no one in particular. He won't let me explain. James stood, his protective instincts toward his mother warring with his loyalty to his father. Mom, how could you? How could you do this to us? Margaret's eyes filled with tears, the first genuine emotion they'd seen from her all morning. You don't understand. None of you understand what it was like back then. Your father was never home. The business was failing. We were fighting. Constantly. So you had an affair, Sarah said quietly, with his business partner, his friend. I was lonely, Margaret's voice cracked. I was 35 years old, and I felt invisible in my own marriage. David saw me. He listened to me. He made me feel like I mattered. The raw honesty of her confession hung in the air like a confession at trial. But honesty, they were learning, didn't necessarily lead to absolution. Emma gathered the letters from the table, their yellow PDF pages seeming to burn her fingers. These detail everything, Margaret. The affair, your feelings for David, your decision to end it when you realized you were pregnant, your fear that Robert would discover the truth. Margaret looked at the letters as if they were evidence of a crime she'd almost forgotten committing. I ended it. I chose my family. I chose Robert. But you never told him the choice wasn't really his to make, Grace observed with characteristic bluntness. The truth of that statement settled over them like a shroud. Margaret had chosen to stay, but she'd never given Robert the information he needed to make his own choice about whether to stay with her. One by one, they began to leave. James helped Lisa gather their things, his jaw set with the rigid control of someone barely containing his anger. Sarah lingered, torn between her role as peacekeeper and her own need to process what she'd learned. Emma was the last to go, standing in the doorway of the house that had been the site of 30 years of Mother's Day celebrations. Margaret remained, at the dining room table, surrounded by the wreckage of her carefully constructed life. I'm sorry, Emma said quietly. I'm sorry it had to happen this way. Margaret looked up, her eyes red with tears and something deeper, a kind of existential exhaustion that came from maintaining a lie for decades. No, you're not, Margaret said with surprising clarity. You're sorry it was messy, but you're not sorry you did it. Emma considered denying it, but they'd had enough lies for one day. She nodded and left Margaret alone with the consequences of choices made 25 years ago and revealed on a perfect Mother's Day morning. The house fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock and the sound of Margaret's quiet weeping. Outside, the spring day continued its indifferent beauty, but inside, a family was learning that some truths, once spoken, could never be taken back. 3 days of silence had settled over the Morrison house like dust on abandoned furniture. Margaret moved through rooms that felt too large and too empty, her footsteps echoing in spaces that had once hummed with family life. Robert's absence was a physical ache, his coffee mug unused on the kitchen counter, his side of the bed untouched, his reading glasses still folded on the nightstand like artifacts from a life that no longer existed. She'd called the hotel twice. Both times Robert had hung up at the sound of her voice. On Wednesday evening, as shadows lengthened across the dining room where her world had collapsed, Margaret finally picked up the phone and dialed Sarah's number. I need to tell you all the truth, she said when her eldest daughter answered. The whole truth, not just what Emma found in those letters. Sarah's silence stretched long enough that Margaret wondered if the connection had been lost. Finally, Mom, I don't think anyone's ready to... I'm ready, Margaret interrupted. I've been carrying this alone for 25 years. I can't do it anymore. The family gathered reluctantly in the living room the next evening, neutral. Territory, away from the dining room that still carried the scent of shattered crystal and broken trust. Sarah sat closest to Margaret, her natural empathy warring with confusion and hurt. James positioned himself across the room, his body language broadcasting skepticism and barely contained anger. Michael chose a chair by the window, as if he might need to escape quickly. Emma arrived last, her presence creating an uncomfortable tension that settled over the room like static electricity. She'd been the catalyst, the truth-teller, but now she seemed uncertain of her role in the aftermath. Grace had declined to come. This is between you and your children, she'd told Margaret on the phone. But Bobby needs to hear this too, whenever he's ready. Margaret looked around the room at the faces of her children, 2 biological, 1 not, though the distinction felt meaningless after 24 years of love and worry and pride. These were her children, regardless of what blood tests or birth certificates might say. I need you to understand what your father and I were going through in 1999, she began, her voice steadier than she'd expected. The construction business was hemorrhaging money. Your father was taking jobs at cost just to keep the company afloat, working 18-hour days, coming home exhausted and angry. She paused, remembering those months of silence that had stretched between her and Robert, like a chasm neither knew how to cross. We weren't talking anymore. We were two strangers sharing a house, managing logistics, who would pick up James from soccer practice, whether we could afford Sarah's piano lessons, but we weren't present with each other. Sarah shifted uncomfortably. She remembered those months, the tension that had filled their childhood home like smoke, the way her parents had spoken around each other rather than to each other. David was different then, Margaret continued. He was going through his own marriage problems. His wife had moved back to her mother's with their kids, and he was living alone above the office. He and your father were barely speaking, disagreeing about every decision, every contract. Margaret's hands twisted in her lap, remembering the weight of isolation that had pressed down on her during those dark months. I started bringing dinner to the office when I knew they'd be working late. Just trying to help, to ease some of the tension. But David would stay after your father left, and we'd talk. Really talk, for the first time in months. About what? Michael's question was quiet, but it carried a desperate need to understand the man whose DNA he apparently carried. Everything. Books, art, dreams we'd abandoned. He'd studied literature before going into construction, did you know that? He'd quote poetry while we ate cold Chinese takeout surrounded by blueprints and budget sheets. James made a sound of disgust. So you bonded over poetry while Dad was killing himself to save the business? Margaret flinched but didn't back down. Your father was unreachable then, James. I tried to talk to him about the problems in our marriage, about how lonely I felt. But he said we didn't have time for emotional nonsense when the business was failing. The phrase hung in the air, emotional nonsense. Even now it carried the sting of dismissal, of a woman's feelings being reduced to inconvenient distractions from more important matters. David listened. He saw me as more than just a wife and mother managing household logistics. He saw me as Margaret, a person with thoughts and feelings and dreams of my own. Emma watched Margaret's confession with the focused attention of someone reevaluating evidence. The letters she'd found had revealed the physical affair, but they hadn't captured this emotional landscape, this slow erosion of a marriage that had created the conditions for betrayal. The affair lasted 6 months, Margaret continued, her voice dropping. It wasn't planned. It wasn't some grand passion. It was two lonely people finding comfort in each other while our marriages fell apart around us. But you got pregnant, Sarah said softly. Margaret nodded, tears beginning to slide down her cheeks. I suspected for weeks before I took the test. The timing was complicated. Your father and I were still sharing a bed, despite everything else that was wrong between us. But deep down, I knew. How could you know? Michael asked, his need to understand overriding the pain of the revelation. Because you were different from the moment I carried you, Margaret said, looking directly at her youngest son. Not just physically, though there were signs. You moved differently in the womb. You were calmer, more thoughtful. Even as a baby, you had this gentleness that reminded me of David. Michael absorbed this information with the quiet intensity that had always marked him as different from his siblings. What happened when you realized? I panicked. Margaret's voice cracked. I ended things with David immediately. Told him I couldn't do it anymore, that I had to try to save my marriage. He wanted to leave his wife, wanted us to be together. But I couldn't. I couldn't destroy 2 families for something that had started as escape from loneliness. Did he know? Michael's question carried the weight of 24 years of wondering about his identity. Did he suspect I might be his son? Margaret closed her eyes, remembering David's last letter, the one Emma hadn't found because Margaret had burned 8 years ago. He wondered. In the last letter he sent, before he moved away, he said he hoped that if you were his child, you'd grow up knowing you were loved. He said he'd always wonder, but that he trusted me to make the right choice for everyone involved. The revelation that David had suspected, had perhaps even cared, hit Michael like a physical blow. He'd spent 3 days coming to terms with having a biological father who was a stranger. Learning that this stranger had actually loved him, in his way from a distance, created a new kind of pain. James stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "So you chose to lie. For 25 years you chose to lie to all of us." "I chose to protect my family," Margaret shot back, some of her old fire returning. "I chose to work on my marriage, to raise my children in a stable home. David moving away made it easier. The partnership dissolved. He started over somewhere else, and your father and I slowly rebuilt what we'd almost lost. But it was still built on a lie," Emma said quietly. It was her first contribution to the conversation, and everyone turned to look at her. "Your reconciliation with Robert, your family stability, it was all built on information he didn't have." Margaret met Emma's gaze with something approaching respect. "Yes, it was. And every day for 25 years I've wondered if I made the right choice. Every time I looked at Michael and saw David's eyes, every time Robert talked about his pride in his youngest son, every time we celebrated Father's Day or Michael's birthdays, I wondered if the truth would be kinder than the lie." "And what did you decide?" Sarah asked. Margaret looked around the room at her children. Biological and chosen, truth and lie, love and deception all mixed together in ways that defied easy categorization. "I decided that love was more important than truth, that the family we built together mattered more than the circumstances of how it started." She paused, wiping her eyes. "I was wrong. Or maybe I was right then, but wrong now. I don't know anymore." The confession hung in the air like a prayer or a plea. Margaret had laid bare 25 years of secrets, guilt, and impossible choices. But forgiveness, they were all learning, wasn't something that could be earned through confession alone. Michael stood, his movement breaking the spell of shared grief that had settled over the room. "I need to know about him, about David, not just the affair, but who he is now, where he is." Margaret nodded, understanding that her confession had opened doors she could no longer control. "He's in Portland, remarried, with children of his own now. He runs a successful architecture firm." "You've kept track of him?" James's question carried accusation. "I've Googled him," Margaret admitted. "Once a year, on your birthday, Michael, just to know he was okay, that he'd built a good life." Michael absorbed this information with the same quiet intensity he brought to his art. The need to understand his biological father, to complete the picture of his identity, was growing stronger than his fear of what he might discover. The confession was over, but the real work of understanding and forgiveness was just beginning. And for the first time in 3 days, Margaret allowed herself to hope that the truth, however painful, might finally set them all free. The call came at 7 in the morning, 3 days after Margaret's confession. Emma was reviewing case files, over coffee when her phone buzzed with Michael's name. "I need your help," he said without preamble. "I need to find him." Emma set down her coffee, recognizing the quiet determination in Michael's voice, a quality she'd never heard from him before. The gentle, accommodating youngest son was gone, replaced by someone who decided to take control of his own story. "Michael, are you sure you're ready for—" "I'm 24 years old," he interrupted. "I've spent my entire life being the son Robert Morrison raised, and I'll always be grateful for that. But I need to know who David Chen is, not just as the man who had an affair with my mother, but as my biological father." They met at Emma's law office that afternoon. Michael arrived carrying a worn leather portfolio, his sketchbook, Emma realized, noting how his fingers traced its edges with nervous energy. He'd always been the artistic one, expressing himself through visual language when words failed. "I've been thinking about what Mom said," Michael began, settling into the chair across from Emma's desk, about David wondering if I was his child, about him hoping I knew I was loved. That's not the behavior of someone who just used my mother and walked away. Emma pulled up her laptop, her legal training kicking in. What exactly do you want? To know about him? Everything. Michael's answer was simple but absolute. Where he lives, what he does, whether he has other children. Mom said Portland, architecture firm. That's a start. The search proved easier than either of them expected. David Chen maintained a professional presence online. His architectural firm's website featured his bio and several award-winning projects. His work was elegant, thoughtful, with a sensitivity to natural light and space that reminded Emma uncomfortably of Michael's own artistic sensibilities. He's 53, Emma read from the screen. Graduated from University of Oregon. With a degree in architecture, minor in literature, founded Chen Design Associates in 2005. Michael leaned forward, studying the photo on the website. David had aged well, silver threading through black hair, lines around his eyes that suggested someone who smiled frequently. But the bone structure, the shape of his hands visible in one photo where he gestured toward a building model, were unmistakably similar to Michael's. He looks like me, Michael said quietly. Or I look like him. They found more through public records and social media. David had remarried in 2003 to a woman named Lily Chen, a high school English teacher. They had 2 children, Jessica, 17, and Daniel, 15. The family photos showed camping trips, art gallery openings, soccer games. A life rebuilt after the wreckage of his first marriage and the affair that had cost him his business partnership with Robert. He coaches his son's soccer team, Michael observed, scrolling through Facebook photos. Looks like they're close. Emma watched Michael process this information. The reality of David as a present, engaged father to 2 teenagers while being completely absent from Michael's life. The complexity of it seemed to fascinate rather than devastate him. This is strange, Michael said, opening his sketchbook. I should be angry, right? He's been living this full life while I grew up not knowing he existed. But looking at these pictures, I'm glad he's happy. Is that weird? Emma considered the question while Michael's pencil moved across the page in swift, sure strokes. He was sketching as he talked, a habit she'd noticed whenever he needed to process complex emotions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What are you drawing? She asked. Michael turned the page toward her. It was an architectural rendering, but not of any building she recognized. The structure seemed to grow organically from the landscape, with flowing lines that suggested both strength and flexibility. I've been sketching buildings lately, Michael explained. Ever since I found out about David. I never thought about architecture before, but suddenly I'm seeing spaces differently. Wondering if it's genetic, this way of thinking about form and function. Emma studied the drawing. It was sophisticated. Work, showing an intuitive understanding of spatial relationships and aesthetic balance. Have you always been interested in design? I thought it was just art, Michael said. But maybe it's more specific than that. Maybe it's how David's mind works too. Over the following days, they uncovered more details about David's life. His firm specialized in sustainable residential design, winning awards for projects that integrated environmental consciousness with aesthetic beauty. He'd written articles about architecture's responsibility to community, served on urban planning committees, taught workshops for aspiring designers. He's not the person I expected, Michael told Sarah during one of their evening walks around their neighborhood. They'd fallen into this routine since the revelation, sibling conversations that helped them both process the fundamental shift in their family's reality. What did you expect? Sarah asked. Michael considered the question, Watching their childhood neighborhood slide by in the golden light of early evening. Someone selfish, I guess. Someone who would abandon his responsibilities and run away. But reading about his work, seeing how he rebuilt his life. He seems thoughtful, responsible. Does that make it easier or harder? Sarah's question cut to the heart of Michael's confusion. I don't know, Michael admitted. If he were a deadbeat, it would be simple. I could dismiss him, focus on the family that raised me. But he's not. He's someone I might actually want to know. They paused at the corner where they'd learned to ride bikes, where Robert had run alongside them until they found their balance. The memory felt different now, not diminished, but complicated by the knowledge that Robert's love for Michael transcended biology. Dad called me yesterday, Sarah said quietly. He's staying at that extended stay hotel near his office. Sounds lost. Michael's chest tightened. I want to see him, but I don't know what to say. How do you maintain a relationship with someone? Who raised you when you're trying to understand someone who didn't? Maybe you don't have to choose, Sarah suggested. Maybe you can love Dad for who he's been to you while also wanting to know David for who he might be to you? The concept seemed revolutionary to Michael. The idea that identity could be additive rather than exclusive. That learning about his biological father didn't diminish his relationship with the man who'd raised him. That night, Michael called Emma. I want to contact him, he said. David. I want to hear his voice, see if there's recognition there, see if he's wondered about me the way I'm wondering about him. Emma had been expecting this moment since they'd started the search. Michael, are you prepared for any outcome? He might not want contact. He has a family now, a life that doesn't include... I know the risks, Michael interrupted. But I need to know. I need to understand who I am beyond the assumptions I've lived with my whole life. Emma heard something in Michael's voice that she'd never heard before. Not just determination, but a kind of fierce self-advocacy that suggested he was finally ready to prioritize his own needs over family harmony. There's something else, Michael added. The health issues I've been having, the genetic condition the doctors mentioned. If David has medical history that could help, don't I owe it to myself to ask? The practical consideration crystallized Emma's own guilt about her role in this family's destruction. She'd told herself she was protecting Michael's health, but now she wondered if her motives had been more complex. If her frustration with Margaret's secrets had driven her to truth-telling that served her own sense of justice more than Michael's well-being. I'll help you find a way to contact him, Emma said finally. But Michael, once you make that call, there's no going back. Your life will change, and so will everyone else's. Michael was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decision made in full awareness of consequences. My life already changed, he said. The moment you stood up at that Mother's Day brunch, everything I thought I knew about myself became questionable. Now I need to find out what's true. The search for David Chen was ending. The search for Michael Morrison's authentic identity was about to begin. Michael stared at his phone for 20 minutes before dialing. He'd rehearsed the conversation a dozen times, but every scenario felt inadequate. How do you introduce yourself? To the man who might be your biological father? How do you bridge 24 years of absence with a single phone call? The number Emma had found was David's direct office line. It rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. Familiar because Michael had been listening to architecture podcast interviews David had given, studying the cadence and tone like a detective gathering evidence. David Chen. Mr. Chen, this is... Michael's prepared speech evaporated. This is Michael Morrison. I think you knew my mother. Margaret Morrison. The silence that followed stretched so long, Michael wondered if the connection had been lost. When David finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of 25 years of wondering. Michael. Not a question, but a recognition. Oh my God. Michael. So you know who I am? David's breath was audible through the phone. "I've wondered about you every day since I left. Every day. How old are you now?" 24. I'll be 25 in August. Another silence. This one filled with mathematical calculation and growing certainty. When David spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "I've hoped it was you. All these years, I've Googled your name, looked for pictures, wondered if—" "You were mine. You look like my father did at your age. I found a photo online from your college graduation." The revelation that David had been watching from a distance, caring from afar, hit Michael like a physical blow. "You've been following my life?" "Not following, just checking, making sure you were okay, that you were growing up happy. Your art exhibition last year, I saw the review in the local paper. I was so proud, and I had no right to be." Michael felt his carefully constructed emotional walls begin to crumble. This wasn't the conversation he'd expected. David wasn't defensive or dismissive. He was a father who'd been separated from his child, maintaining a loving vigil from across the country. "Why didn't you ever reach out?" Michael asked. David was quiet for a long moment. "Because I destroyed enough lives in 1999. Your mother chose to stay with Robert, to preserve your family. I respected that choice, even though it nearly killed me." "What do you mean it nearly killed you?" "Michael, I didn't just have an affair. With your mother, I fell in love with her. Completely, stupidly, destructively in love. When she ended things, when she chose her marriage over what we had, I left because staying would have meant fighting for her, and that would have torn your family apart." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Michael had expected the technical details of an affair, but this was something deeper. A love story that had ended in sacrifice rather than selfishness. "She said you wrote her letters." "Dozens of them. Most I never sent. The ones I did send, I probably shouldn't have. But I needed her to know that what we had wasn't casual, wasn't just loneliness or opportunity. I loved her, and if you were my son, I loved you too, even though I'd never met you." Michael closed his eyes, feeling the fundamental narrative of his existence shifting again. Do you want to meet me?" "More than anything in the world," David said without hesitation. "But Michael, I have a family now, 2 teenagers, who don't know anything about you or your mother. This is going to be complicated." "I understand complicated," Michael said. "My family's been living with your secret for 25 years. Now they're learning to live with the truth." They talked for another hour. David described his life in Portland, his architectural practice, his children Jessica and Daniel. He asked about Michael's art, his health issues, his relationship with Robert. The conversation flowed with an ease that surprised them both, 2 strangers connected by DNA and circumstances, finding common ground in shared sensibilities and similar ways of seeing the world. When Michael finally hung up, he felt emotionally drained but oddly complete. For the first time in weeks, he understood why he'd always felt slightly out of step with his siblings, why his artistic nature had seemed to come from nowhere, why he'd inherited a love of literature and design that neither Robert nor Margaret possessed. The phone rang an hour later. Margaret's name appeared on the screen. "He called me," she said without preamble. "David called me. He said you reached out to him." "Yes. Michael, sweetheart, I understand you're curious, but this is dangerous." "David isn't. He isn't someone you can trust to keep your life stable." "He seemed pretty stable to me, Mom. Successful business, happy marriage, kids he's raising well." Margaret's silence was different from David's, not reflective, but calculating. "He's married? Since 2003, 2 children, and he wants to see you?" "Yes." Michael heard the fear in his mother's voice and felt a stab of sympathy. "Mom, This doesn't change how I feel about you, or about Dad, but I need to know who I am. You're my son, Margaret said fiercely. You're Robert's son. Biology doesn't change 24 years of love and family. Before Michael could respond, his phone beeped with another call. Robert's name appeared on the screen, the first contact he'd had with his father since the Mother's Day revelation. Dad's calling, Michael said. I have to. Don't tell him about David wanting to meet you, Margaret said quickly. Please. Michael, your father can't handle any more right now. But when Michael switched to Robert's call, he realized his father already knew. Is it true? Robert's voice was hollow, defeated. Sarah said you found him, that you talked to him. Dad, I can explain. 24 years, Robert interrupted. 24 years I raised you, loved you, taught you to ride a bike and throw a baseball and balance a checkbook. And now you're ready to replace me with the man who destroyed our family? It's not about replacement, Michael said desperately. It's about understanding who I am. You're my son, Robert said, his voice breaking. Doesn't that mean anything? Anymore? The pain in Robert's voice cut Michael deeper than anything else in this entire ordeal. This was the man who'd stayed up all night when Michael had pneumonia at age 7, who'd attended every art show and school play, who'd taught him that a man's worth was measured by his reliability and his love for his family. It means everything. Dad, but I still need to meet him. Robert hung up without saying goodbye. Within an hour, James was at Michael's apartment, his face flushed with anger and something approaching panic. You're destroying this family, James said, pushing past Michael into the small living space. First, Emma drops that bomb at Mother's Day. Then Mom confesses to 25 years of lies. Dad moves out of the house, and now you're chasing after some stranger who abandoned us before you were even born. He didn't abandon me, James. He never knew for certain I was his son. And now he does, and he wants to meet you. And you're ready to throw away everything Dad has given you for what? Curiosity? Some fantasy about finding your real father? Michael felt his own anger rising. Robert will always be my dad, but David is my biological father, and I have a right to know him. James stepped closer, his voice dropping to the dangerous quiet their father used when he was truly furious. You have a choice to make, Michael. Us or him. Family or fantasy. Because Dad can't handle both, and frankly, neither can I. The ultimatum hung in the air like a sword. Choose the family that raised you or the stranger who helped create you. Choose loyalty or curiosity. Choose the past or the future. Michael looked at his brother, successful, conventional, certain in his worldview, and realized they'd never been more different than they were in this moment. I'm not choosing between families, James. I'm trying to understand what family means. It means the people who were there for you, James shot back, not the people who contributed genetic material and walked away. After James left, Michael sat alone in his apartment, surrounded by the sketches he'd been making since learning about David. Architectural drawings, family portraits with missing faces, abstract representations of identity and belonging. His art had always been his way of processing the world, but now it felt like archaeology, digging through layers of assumption to find bedrock truth. His phone buzzed with a text from David. I'd like to drive down this weekend. Would you be willing to meet in person? Michael stared at the message, knowing that answering yes would cross a line his family might never forgive. But the alternative, living with questions that would haunt him forever, felt impossible. He typed back, yes, I'd like that very much. The past was about to become present, and Michael Morrison was about to meet the man whose choices 25 years ago had shaped every day of his life. Michael arrived at Riverside Park 30 minutes early, choosing a picnic table near the water where the sound of the current might mask the awkwardness of conversation. He'd barely slept, alternating between anticipation and dread, sketching David's face from memory of online photos until his notebook was filled with variations of features he'd never seen in person. David appeared at exactly 2:00, walking across the grass with the measured gait of someone approaching a moment 25 years in the making. He was taller than Michael had expected, broader in the shoulders, but the resemblance was unmistakable. They had the same hands, the same way of tilting their head when thinking, the same dark eyes that seemed to catalog details for later contemplation. Michael. David stopped a few feet away, as if uncertain whether a handshake or embrace was appropriate for meeting your biological son for the first time. David. The name felt strange on Michael's tongue. Too formal for a father, too casual for a stranger. They sat across from each other at the picnic table, the weight of unspoken questions filling the space between them. David pulled out a manila folder, his architectural training evident in how he organized his thoughts into presentable materials. "I brought some things," David said, his voice carrying the slight nervousness of someone delivering a presentation to a critical audience. "Photos from when I was your age, some of my early design work, medical history for your doctors." Michael opened the folder and felt his breath catch. The young man in the photos could have been Michael himself. Same bone structure, same thoughtful expression, same artistic sensibility evident in how he posed unconsciously against architectural backgrounds. "The resemblance is," Michael began. "Unmistakable," David finished. "I knew the moment I saw your graduation photo online. You're my father's grandson, no question." They talked cautiously at first, finding common ground in shared interests, architecture, literature, the way light moved through spaces. David described his work, his philosophy of design that prioritized human experience over aesthetic showmanship. Michael found himself nodding, recognizing his own artistic instincts in David's approach to creating functional beauty. "I've been wondering," Michael said after 20 minutes of careful conversation, "why architecture? Why not fine art? Like, me?" David smiled, the first genuine expression of joy Michael had seen from him. "Because I needed to build things that lasted. After I left your mother, after the business with Robert fell apart, I needed to create something permanent. Something that would outlive my mistakes." The honesty in David's answer broke something open in Michael's chest. This wasn't the conversation of strangers anymore. This was a father explaining himself to his son. "I'm sorry," David continued, his composure beginning to crack. "I'm sorry I wasn't there when you were sick as a child, when you won art contests, when you graduated. I'm sorry I missed 24 years of your life because I couldn't figure out how to love your mother without destroying her family." Michael was about to respond when he noticed a familiar figure walking across the park. Robert approached with the grim determination of a man who'd decided to face his demons head-on. "Dad?" Michael stood, torn between relief and panic. "I didn't know you were—" "Sarah told me where you'd be," Robert said, his eyes fixed on David with 25 years of accumulated pain and anger. "Thought it was time the three of us had a conversation." David rose slowly, recognizing his former friend and business partner despite the years and the weight both men now carried. They stood facing each other like gunfighters in an old western, with Michael caught between them as both prize and referee. "Robert," David said quietly, "you look well." "Do I?" Robert's voice carried bitter amusement. "Because I feel like a man who just discovered his entire life was built on lies." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire neither man could extinguish. David absorbed it without defending himself, understanding that he'd forfeited the right to protest his innocence 25 years ago. "You're right," David said. "I destroyed your business, your marriage, your trust. I destroyed everything good between us because I couldn't control my feelings for your wife." "My wife," Robert repeated. "The woman you were fucking while I—" Worked 18-hour days trying to save our company. Michael flinched at the crude language, but David didn't retreat from Robert's anger. I loved her, David said simply. I know that doesn't excuse what I did, but I need you to understand it wasn't casual, wasn't just opportunity or convenience. I loved Margaret, and I loved the idea of the child she might be carrying. The child you were willing to let me raise as my own, Robert shot back. 24 years, David. 24 years of diapers and doctor visits and parent-teacher conferences and college tuition. Where the hell were you? Staying away because Margaret asked me to, David replied. Respecting her choice to preserve her family, even though it killed me to do it. It killed you? Robert's voice rose. What about what it did to me? What about building my identity around being this boy's father, only to discover he was never mine to begin with? Michael stepped between them, his artist's sensitivity overwhelmed by the raw pain radiating from both men. Stop, he said firmly. Both of you, just stop. I'm not a possession to be fought over or a mistake to be regretted. I'm a person who had one father who raised him and one father who contributed DNA. Both of those things can be true without diminishing either of you. Before either man could respond, Margaret appeared at the edge of the park, having followed Robert from the hotel where he'd been staying. She approached the group with the careful steps of someone walking toward her own execution. I see we're having the conversation I've been dreading for 25 years, she said, her voice steadier than Michael expected. The three adults who'd created this crisis 25 years ago now stood in a triangle of mutual hurt and complicated love, with Michael at the center as both catalyst and victim of their choices. David looked at Margaret with an expression Michael couldn't quite read. Pain, longing, regret, and something that might have been enduring love all mixed together. You look exactly the same, David said softly. I feel ancient, Margaret replied. Like I've been carrying the weight of this secret so long it became part of my skeleton. Robert watched this exchange with the hollow expression of a man witnessing the confirmation of his worst fears. The easy intimacy between Margaret and David, even after 25 years of separation, made clear that their affair had been more than physical betrayal. So what now? Robert asked. Do I just pretend the last 24 years didn't happen? Do I walk away from the son I raised so you two can play happy family with the child you created? No, Michael said before either of his biological parents could respond. You don't walk away and they don't get to pretend I'm their do-over. I'm 24 years old. I get to decide what my relationships look like. Sarah appeared at the edge of the confrontation, having followed the trail of family destruction from Robert's hotel to Margaret's panicked phone call to this park, where their family's future was being negotiated in real time. This is insane, she said, looking around at the four adults and her brother. We're in a public park having the kind of conversation that should happen in therapy, not in front of joggers and dog walkers. But Michael shook his head. No, this is exactly where it should happen. Out in the open, with witnesses, so nobody can pretend it didn't occur or remember it differently later. He looked around at the adults who'd shaped his life through their choices and secrets. David, I want to know you. I want to understand the parts of me that came from you. But Robert will always be my dad, because that's what 24 years of love and presence means. He turned to Robert. Dad, meeting David doesn't diminish what you gave me. It just helps me understand who I am completely. Finally, he faced Margaret. Mom, your secret kept this family together for 25 years, but it also kept us from dealing with the truth. Now we have to figure out how to be a family that includes truth instead of hiding from it. The five of them stood in a circle of complicated love and pain, surrounded by the normalcy of a Saturday afternoon in a public park. Children played on swings, couples walked dogs, life continued around them while they tried to figure out how to rebuild a family that had been simultaneously destroyed and completed by the truth. David was the first to break the silence. I should go, This is too much, too fast. No, Michael said firmly. You came here to meet me. We haven't finished meeting yet. And for the first time since Emma's toast had shattered their world, Michael Morrison took control of his own story. The extended stay hotel room had become Robert's monastic cell, a place of enforced solitude where he'd spent 10 days trying to reconcile 30 years of assumed truth with the reality of betrayal. The beige walls and generic furniture felt appropriate for a man whose entire identity had been stripped down to its foundation, leaving him to examine what remained when everything he'd believed about his life proved to be built on lies. Grace found him there on a Tuesday evening, letting herself in with the spare key he'd given her after the third day when she'd worried he might not answer the door. "You look like hell, Bobby," she said, setting a bag of takeout Chinese food on the small table by the window. Robert glanced up from the legal documents he'd been studying. Divorce papers his attorney had drawn up, but that remained unsigned. "I feel worse than I look." Grace settled into the room's single chair, studying her brother with the sharp attention that had made her suspicious of Margaret from the beginning. Robert sat on the edge of the bed, shoulders slumped with the weight of decision deferred. "Tell me what you're thinking," Grace said. "I'm thinking I don't know who I am anymore." Robert's voice carried the hollow tone of a man questioning everything he'd previously taken for granted. "For 30 years, I've been Robert Morrison, Margaret's husband, father to Sarah, James, and Michael, successful contractor, good provider. Now I discover that Margaret never really chose me, she just chose safety. And Michael." He couldn't finish the sentence. "Michael is still your son," Grace said firmly. "Biology doesn't erase 24 years of love and presence." "Doesn't it?" Robert looked at his sister with genuine confusion. "How do I separate what I felt as his father from what I feel knowing he's not mine? How do I look at him without seeing David's face? How do I watch him build a relationship with his real father and pretend it doesn't gut me?" Grace was quiet. For a long moment, choosing her words carefully. "Can I tell you something I've never told anyone?" Robert nodded. "I was married before Tom, briefly when I was 22. His name was Daniel, and I thought I loved him desperately. Turned out he was gambling away our money and sleeping with my best friend. When I found out, I felt exactly like you do now, like my entire reality had been a performance I wasn't aware I was giving." Robert stared at his sister, realizing how much of her history he'd never known. "What did you do?" "I divorced him, moved back home, spent 2 years convinced I'd never trust anyone again. Then I met Tom, and I had to decide whether Daniel's betrayal would define the rest of my life or whether I could build something new based on what I'd learned about myself." "It's not the same thing, Grace. You and Daniel didn't have children. Together. You didn't build 3 decades of life on false assumptions." Grace leaned forward. "No, but I learned that betrayal tells you more about the betrayer than it does about you. Margaret's affair doesn't change who you are, Bobby. It changes who she is. The question is whether you can love the woman she actually is instead of the woman you thought she was." Robert picked up one of the divorce papers, scanning the legal language that would dissolve his marriage with clinical efficiency. "I don't know if I can. Every time I look at her, I see 25 years of lies. Every family photo, every anniversary, every time she said she loved me. How much of it was real, and how much was guilt?" "Only she can answer that," Grace said. "But I can tell you what I've observed over the years." Robert set down the papers, giving his sister his full attention. "Margaret has been many things, controlling, secretive, sometimes cold. But she's never been indifferent to you. Even when I suspected something was wrong, even when I caught glimpses of guilt or fear in her behavior, I never doubted that she loved you. Complicated love, burdened love, but love nonetheless. Love built on deception. Love that chose your family over easier alternatives. Grace corrected. David wanted her to leave you, Bobby. I heard him on the phone once, during those last months before he moved away. He was begging her to start over with him. She chose to stay, to work on your marriage, to raise Michael as your son. The revelation hit Robert like a physical blow. She could have left? She could have left. She chose to stay and fight for what you built together, even though it meant carrying a secret that ate at her for 25 years. Robert absorbed this information, trying to reconcile it with his image of Margaret as someone who'd simply been selfish and reckless. The idea that she'd made a deliberate choice to preserve their family, at the cost of her own emotional freedom, complicated his narrative of pure victimhood. I need to see the office, Robert said suddenly. I need to remember what we were like before David, before everything went wrong. They drove to Morrison Construction in Grace's car, the familiar building looking smaller and shabbier than Robert remembered. He'd built this business from nothing, starting with a pickup truck and a toolbox, growing it into a company that employed 30 people and built homes throughout the county. David was a good partner, Robert said as they stood in the parking. What? Before everything fell apart, we worked well together. He handled design and client relations. I managed construction and budgets. We complemented each other. Until you didn't, Grace observed. Robert used his key to let them into the office, now run by the foreman he'd promoted when he retired. The walls still displayed photos from major projects, custom homes, commercial buildings, the community center that had won a design award. In several photos, Robert and David stood together, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning with the satisfaction of successful collaboration. Look at us, Robert said, studying a photo from 1998, a year before the affair, before everything changed. We look like brothers. You were brothers, in a way. That's what made the betrayal so devastating. Robert moved through the office, touching familiar objects, remembering the rhythm of partnership that had defined his professional life for 15 years. He paused at a drafting table where David used to work, imagining him bent over architectural drawings while Margaret brought them dinner during those long nights when the business was struggling. I can see how it happened, Robert said quietly. I was never home, always stressed about money and contracts. Margaret was lonely. David was lonely. They were both trying to hold our world together while I was too proud and too scared to admit we were failing. Understanding doesn't require forgiveness, Grace said gently, but it might make forgiveness possible. They sat in Robert's old office, surrounded by the evidence of a life built through 30 years of work and dedication. Robert pulled out his phone and scrolled through photos, family vacations, holidays, birthday parties. Michael appeared in hundreds of images, from infancy through college graduation, and in every photo, Robert's love for his youngest son was unmistakable. I can't look at these pictures and see David's child, Robert said. I see my son. The boy I taught to throw a curveball, the teenager I drove to art classes, the young man I hugged at graduation. Biology might have created him, but love raised him. Then maybe that's your answer, Grace suggested. Robert's phone buzzed with a text from Michael. Dad, can we talk? I need you to know that meeting David doesn't change how I feel about you. Robert stared at the message, feeling something in his chest begin to loosen. He's been trying to reach me for days. I haven't known what to say. Maybe start with the truth, that you love him, that you're hurt and confused, but that you're trying to figure out how to move forward. Robert called Michael, and his son answered on the first ring. Dad, I'm so glad you called. Michael, I owe you an apology. Walking away from you at the park, avoiding your calls, that wasn't fair. You didn't ask for any of this. Neither did you, Dad. I can't imagine how this feels for you. Robert found himself crying, the first tears he'd shed since Emma's revelation 2 weeks ago. It feels like losing everything and nothing at the same time. I love you so much, son. You're my boy, blood or no blood. But I'm terrified that meeting David means I'm going to lose you to someone who can give you things I never could. Dad, David can give me genetic information and maybe help me understand certain parts of my personality. But you gave me everything that matters: love, stability, values, the foundation of who I am as a person. I don't want a relationship with David instead of you. I want to understand both parts of my heritage while keeping the relationship we've built. The conversation lasted an hour, with both men working through 24 years of father-son love, complicated by new knowledge of genetic reality. By the end, Robert felt something he hadn't experienced since the Mother's Day revelation: hope that his family could survive this crisis transformed but not destroyed. 2 days later, Robert sat across from Dr. Sarah Martinez, a therapist his physician had recommended. The office was warm and professional, designed to facilitate difficult conversations about life's most challenging transitions. "Tell me about your marriage before the affair," Dr. Martinez said. Robert described the early years with Margaret, the courtship, the wedding, the excitement of building a life together. He talked about the stress of starting a business, the financial pressures, the way work had gradually consumed more and more of his time and attention. "It sounds like you were both struggling with isolation," Dr. Martinez observed. "You were isolated by work pressure and financial responsibility. Margaret was isolated by your absence and the demands of managing home and family alone. Does that excuse what she did?" "It doesn't excuse it, but it might explain it. People in isolation make choices they wouldn't make if they felt connected and supported." Robert spent several sessions exploring his own role in the marriage's deterioration, acknowledging how his focus on providing financially had sometimes meant failing to provide emotionally. It didn't excuse Margaret's affair, but it helped him understand the context that had made it possible. "The question now," Dr. Martinez said during their 4th session, "is whether you can rebuild your marriage on a foundation of truth instead of assumption. Whether you can love the woman Margaret actually is instead of the woman you thought she was." "How do I know who she actually is? How do I trust anything after 25 years of lies?" You start with small truths and see if she can handle them. You ask for transparency and see if she can provide it. You acknowledge that rebuilding trust is a process that requires patience from both of you. That evening, Robert drove to the house he'd shared with Margaret for 20 years. She met him at the door, her face carrying the weight of 2 weeks spent wondering if her marriage would survive her confession. "I've been seeing a therapist," Robert said without preamble. "Trying to understand what I'm feeling, what I want." Margaret nodded, stepping aside to let him enter. The house felt different. Not like home exactly, but not like a foreign space either. Something in between, waiting to be redefined. "I've been seeing one too," Margaret said, "trying to understand why I kept the secret so long, why I couldn't trust you with the truth." They sat in the living room where they'd spent thousands of evenings together, watching their children grow up, planning for retirement, believing they knew each other completely. "I can't promise I can get past this," Robert said. "I can't promise I can learn to trust you again. But I'm willing to try, if you're willing to be completely honest going forward." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I'm willing. I'm so tired of carrying secrets, Bobby. I just want to be real with you, even if it's messy and complicated." Robert reached across the space between them and took her hand, the first physical contact they'd had since Emma's revelation shattered their world. "Then let's try to build something real," he said. "Not perfect, but real." Outside, spring was turning toward summer, and the Morrison family was beginning the long, uncertain work of healing. October arrived with the subtle shift that marked autumn in suburban neighborhoods. Leaves beginning their slow turn toward gold, football games echoing from high school stadiums, and the Morrison family gathering for Sunday dinner at a house that had slowly transformed from crime scene to home again. Margaret stood in her kitchen, preparing the same pot roast she'd made countless times before, but everything felt different now. The conversations flowing from the dining room carried a quality of authentic engagement that had been missing for years, perhaps decades. No more careful navigation around sensitive topics. No more polite deflection when discussions grew too real. "Mom, do you need help?" Sarah appeared in the doorway, but her offer carried genuine care rather than the dutiful obligation that had characterized so many of their interactions before the truth came out. "I'm fine, sweetheart. How are the kids adjusting to the new school?" Sarah leaned against the counter, a gesture that would have been impossible during the months when every family interaction felt like walking through a minefield. "Better than I expected. Emma's started therapy too. She was struggling with guilt about what happened at Mother's Day." Margaret paused in her stirring. 6 months ago, the mention of Emma's name would have sent her blood pressure skyrocketing. Now it prompted something closer to understanding than anger. "How is she doing?" "Better. She's been working with Dr. Rodriguez on understanding the difference between necessary truth-telling and, well, the way she chose to tell the truth." Margaret nodded. The family had spent months in various therapeutic configurations: individual sessions, couples counseling for her and Robert, family therapy sessions that sometimes included Emma and sometimes didn't, depending on who felt ready to face what truths. The process had been exhausting and frequently painful, but it had also been illuminating in ways none of them had anticipated. "I should probably talk to her soon," Margaret said. "We can't keep avoiding each other at family gatherings forever." "She'd like that, I think. She never wanted to hurt anyone, Mom. She was just terrified that Michael's health issues were connected to not knowing his real medical history." Margaret understood that now, though it had taken months of therapy and countless conversations with Dr. Kim to reach that understanding. Emma's revelation had been devastating in its execution, but it had been motivated by love for Michael rather than malice toward Margaret. That distinction had become crucial to Margaret's ability to forgive, not just Emma, but herself. From the living room came the sound of Robert's laughter, genuine, unforced laughter that had been absent from their house for years before the affair revelation and had slowly returned over the past few months. He was talking with James about wedding planning, a conversation that would have been impossible 6 months ago when James had been too angry to speak to anyone civilly. "James seems happier," Margaret observed. Sarah smiled. "He told me last week that he'd never realized how exhausting it was to maintain the illusion of family perfection. He said knowing everyone's flaws and loving them anyway felt more sustainable than pretending no one had any flaws." It was a revelation that had surprised all of them. James, the family member most invested in conventional stability, had ultimately found peace in accepting complexity rather than fighting it. His engagement to Lisa had been announced 3 months ago, but unlike his previous relationship milestones, this one had been shared with the family's full knowledge of their imperfections and complications. "Michael called this morning," Margaret said, stirring the gravy with more attention than it required. "He's driving down from Portland tonight." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Another visit with David?" "He spent last weekend there, helped Jessica with her college application essays, and went to Daniel's soccer tournament. David's wife Lily seems to have accepted the situation better than any of us did." The complexity of Michael's relationship with his biological father had been perhaps the most surprising development of the past 6 months. What had started as curiosity about genetic heritage had evolved into genuine affection and family connection. Michael spent 2 weekends a month in Portland, developing relationships not just with David, but with his teenage half-siblings. "How does Dad handle it?" Sarah asked gently. Margaret considered the question, remembering the months of individual and couples therapy that had helped Robert work through his feelings about sharing Michael with David. "Better than I expected." He told Dr. Martinez that he's learned the difference between being replaced and being expanded. "Michael's love for David doesn't diminish his love for your father. It just makes his capacity for love bigger." It was. A hard-won understanding that had required Robert to fundamentally reconsider his conception of fatherhood and family. The man who had once built his identity around being the sole provider and protector had learned to find meaning in being one of several people who loved and supported his children. The front door opened with the familiar sound that announced Michael's arrival. Margaret heard his voice greeting Robert, followed by the warm exchanges that had gradually replaced the awkward tension of the first months after the revelation. Michael's relationship with Robert had been tested by the truth, but it had ultimately emerged stronger, built on authentic understanding rather than assumed biology. "How was Portland?" Sarah asked as Michael appeared in the kitchen. "Good. Really good." Michael's face carried the glow of someone who had spent the weekend feeling fully understood and accepted. "David's firm is working on a sustainable housing project that's absolutely brilliant. And Jessica got into her first-choice college, early admission to Reed." Margaret felt the familiar stab of complex emotion that accompanied updates about David's family. Pride in Jessica's achievement, curiosity about David's professional success, and a persistent thread of longing for the life that might have been. But these feelings no longer carried the weight of secrets and shame. She could acknowledge them, process them with Dr. Kim, and move forward without being paralyzed by their complexity. "That's wonderful news," Margaret said, and meant it. "You'll have to tell her congratulations from all of us." Michael studied his mother's face, still sometimes surprised by her genuine acceptance of his relationship with David's family. The woman who had guarded family secrets so fiercely had learned to embrace transparency, even when it was uncomfortable. "Actually," Michael said, pulling an envelope from his jacket pocket, "I wanted to talk to everyone about something tonight. I've been invited to show my work at a gallery in Portland next month. It's a solo exhibition." Sarah hugged him enthusiastically. "Michael, that's incredible. Your first solo show." "What's the theme?" Margaret asked, though she suspected. She already knew. Michael's art had undergone a dramatic evolution since the revelation, moving from pleasant landscapes and portraits to complex explorations of identity, family, and belonging. "It's called Intersections," Michael said. "Pieces about the places where different parts of ourselves meet, where biology intersects with choice, where secrets intersect with truth, where love intersects with complexity." Margaret felt her chest tighten with emotion. Her son had taken the most painful experience of their family's life and transformed it into art that might help other people understand their own complicated relationships and identities. "I'd like everyone to come to the opening," Michael continued. "Everyone. Dad, Mom, Sarah, James, Emma, and David's family too." The prospect of all the key players in their family drama gathering in the same space for a celebration rather than a confrontation felt both terrifying and healing. Margaret looked toward the dining room where Robert and James were discussing football statistics with the easy camaraderie that had slowly returned to their relationship. "Are you sure you're ready for that?" Margaret asked. "All of us together." "In public?" Michael nodded. "I think we're ready to be a family that includes all our complications rather than hiding from them." 2 hours later, the Morrison family sat around their dining room table for the first time since the Mother's Day brunch that had changed everything. But unlike that carefully orchestrated meal, this dinner was marked by genuine conversation, shared laughter, and the kind of honest engagement that had been missing from their interactions for years. Emma arrived as they were serving dessert, carrying flowers and the tentative hope of someone who had spent months wondering if she would ever be welcome at family gatherings again. Margaret met her at the door with an embrace that surprised them both. "Thank you," Margaret said quietly, the words carrying 6 months of processing and understanding. "I know how hard it was to tell the truth, and I know you did it because you love Michael." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry about how I did it. I should have found a way to talk to you privately first, to give you a chance to tell the truth yourself." "Maybe," Margaret acknowledged. But I had months to tell the truth, and I couldn't find the courage. You did what I couldn't do, even though it cost you. They joined the family at the table, where Robert was describing his and Margaret's progress. In couples therapy with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had learned that healing required acknowledgement rather than shame. Dr. Martinez says we're doing the work most couples should do before they get married, Robert said. Learning to see each other as we actually are instead of as we hoped the other person would be. Is it working? James asked. His relationship with his parents had been perhaps the most transformed by the revelation. The son who had most needed them to be perfect had learned to love them as flawed humans. Robert and Margaret exchanged a look that carried 6 months of difficult conversations, painful honesty, and gradual rebuilding of trust. Some days, Margaret said, some days we remember why we fell in love in the first place. Other days we have to work at choosing to love each other despite everything we now know. That sounds more honest than what you had before, Sarah observed. It is, Robert agreed. And honesty, it turns out, is a better foundation for a marriage than the illusion of perfection. As the evening wound down, Michael shared more details about his upcoming exhibition. The paintings he described sounded like visual representations of their family's journey. Portraits that included shadows and light, landscapes that showed both destruction and regrowth, abstract pieces that explored the space between truth and lie, love and betrayal, family and chosen family. I want to dedicate the show to all of us, Michael said as they cleared the dinner dishes. To families that survive telling the truth about themselves. Margaret looked around at her family, biological and chosen, complicated and healing, honest and imperfect, and felt something she hadn't experienced in 25 years. Peace with the truth of who they all were. Outside, autumn was settling over their neighborhood, with the promise of winter followed by spring. Inside, the Morrison family was learning that love, when built on truth rather than illusion, could survive almost anything. The calendar on Margaret's kitchen counter showed that Mother's Day was still 7 months away, but for the first time in years, she was looking forward to it. The May morning sun streamed through the same crystal chandelier in Margaret's dining room, casting familiar rainbows across the mahogany table. But everything else about this Mother's Day was different from the last. The table had been extended to accommodate 12 people instead of 7. The conversations hummed with authentic warmth rather than polite performance. And Margaret Chen Morrison, standing in her kitchen with flour on her apron and peace in her heart, was preparing to host the most complicated and beautiful Mother's Day brunch of her life. "Mom, where do you want the flowers?" Sarah asked, carrying an enormous arrangement of peonies and roses, contributions from multiple families now, not just her own children. "On the sideboard, next to the photos," Margaret replied, gesturing toward the collection of family pictures that now told a more complete story. The formal portraits were still there, but they were joined by candid shots from Michael's art exhibition, photos from his visits to Portland, images of Robert and Margaret in couples therapy workshops looking tired but hopeful. The kitchen buzzed with activity as multiple generations of women worked together. Lily Chen, David's wife, was helping Sarah arrange fruit salad while asking genuine questions about Margaret's French toast casserole recipe. Jessica, David's 17-year-old daughter, was teaching Margaret's granddaughter how to fold napkins into perfect peaks. The scene would have been unimaginable a year ago, but it felt natural now. "I still can't believe this is happening," Lily said, pausing in her fruit arrangement to look around the kitchen. "When David told me about Michael, about wanting to meet him, I was terrified it would destroy our family. Instead, it's just made our family bigger." Margaret met Lily's eyes across the kitchen, seeing her own fears reflected there. Both women had married men carrying secrets, but while Margaret had kept her husband's secret for 25 years, Lily had learned David's within months of Michael's phone call. "How did you handle it?" Margaret asked quietly. Learning that your husband had a son he'd never told you about? Lily considered the question, her hands still working with the fruit. At first I was angry. Not at Michael. He didn't ask to be born. But at David for carrying that secret for so long. Then I realized that secrets have a way of poisoning relationships. And David was choosing to end the secret by being honest with me and the kids. That choice mattered more than the 24 years of not knowing. Through the kitchen window, Margaret could see the men setting up chairs in the backyard. Robert and David worked side by side, their movements still carrying some awkwardness, but no longer the sharp tension of unresolved anger. They were learning to be something unprecedented, co-fathers to the same young man, united by love for Michael rather than divided by past betrayal. Michael moved between the two men, clearly, comfortable with both, his identity no longer fragmented by secrets but expanded by truth. He looked healthier than he had in months, his genetic condition finally under proper medical management thanks to David's family medical history. He looks so much like David did at that age, Margaret said, watching her youngest son through the window. But he moves like Robert, Lily observed with a smile. That careful, deliberate way of approaching tasks. Biology isn't everything. James appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking more relaxed than Margaret had seen him in years. Marriage to Lisa had been good for him, but the family's commitment to honesty had been even better. The son who had once needed everyone to be perfect had learned to find strength in accepting complexity. "Mom, David's here," James said, and the casual way he said David's name, without hesitation or awkwardness, marked how far they'd all traveled in 12 months. David Chen entered the kitchen carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the slightly nervous expression of someone who still couldn't quite believe he was welcome at his former lover's family gatherings. But Margaret greeted him warmly, accepting his cheek kiss with the easy affection that had slowly replaced their complicated history. "Thank you for including us," David said quietly. "This means more than I can express." "We're all family now," Margaret replied, and meant it. Complicated family, but family nonetheless. Emma arrived as they were moving the food to the dining room, her presence no longer creating the tension it had for months after her revelation. She carried herself with more confidence now, her role as truth-teller having evolved into something like family historian. The one who remembered why honesty, however painful, was preferable to comfortable lies. "Emma, perfect timing," Robert called from the dining room, where he was opening wine. "We were just about to start." The expanded Morrison-Chen family gathered around the table, an arrangement that would have horrified Margaret's perfectionist sensibilities a year ago, but now felt exactly right. Robert sat at one head of the table, Margaret at the other, with David and Lily integrated naturally among their children and grandchildren. The formal place settings were gone, replaced by mismatched plates and genuine warmth. Grace had arrived, fashionably late, her sharp eyes taking in the scene with satisfaction. "Well," she announced, settling into her chair, "this is either the most dysfunctional family gathering in suburban history or the most honest one." "Why not both?" Michael asked, raising his orange juice glass with a grin that was purely his own, not Robert's, not David's, but uniquely Michael Morrison-Chen's. The conversation flowed easily through the meal, touching on Jessica's college plans, Daniel's soccer season, Sarah's promotion at work, James and Lisa's house hunting. These were the ordinary moments that comprised family life, but they carried the weight of chosen connection rather than obligated relationships. "I have an announcement," Michael said as they finished the main course. "The Portland Gallery wants to extend my exhibition for another 2 months, and I've been invited to show my work in Seattle and San Francisco." The table erupted in congratulations, but Margaret noticed how both Robert and David beamed with paternal pride. Neither man was trying to claim credit for Michael's success, but both were clearly delighted by his achievements. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Margaret said. "Will you be moving to Portland permanently?" Michael shook his head. I'm keeping my apartment here. This is still home. But I'm spending more time in Portland, getting to know that part of my family, too. He looked around the table at all the adults who had shaped his life through their choices and their love. I've learned this year that family isn't about choosing sides. It's about having enough love to include everyone who matters to you. Robert cleared his throat, standing to address the group. A year ago, he'd been the confident patriarch whose world was about to crumble. Now, he was a man who had learned to find strength in vulnerability, leadership in admitting uncertainty. I want to say something, Robert began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak about survival. A year ago, at this same table, our family was destroyed by the truth. Or at least, that's what I thought was happening. He paused, looking at Margaret with the complicated love of someone who had chosen forgiveness over easier alternatives. What I've learned is that our family wasn't destroyed by the truth. It was freed by it. We spent 25 years building relationships on assumptions and secrets. Now we're building them on knowledge and choice. That's harder work, but it creates something stronger. Robert raised his glass. To families that survive telling the truth about themselves. The toast was echoed around the table, but Emma shook her head, standing to address the group that had become her extended family through crisis and healing. Actually, Emma said, I'd like to propose a different toast. Margaret felt her chest tighten, remembering the last time Emma had stood to make a toast at this table. But Emma's expression was warm, not challenging, and her voice carried gratitude rather than accusation. A year ago, I made a choice that changed all of our lives, Emma continued. I chose truth over comfort, knowledge over ignorance, difficult honesty over easy lies. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, and it hurt people I love. She looked directly at Margaret. But I've learned something this year about love and secrets. Secrets don't protect the people we love. They protect us from having to face difficult truths. Real love means being willing to face those truths together. Emma raised her glass higher. So I want to toast families that choose difficult love over easy love. Families that choose honesty over harmony. Families that choose to include rather than exclude, to expand rather than contract, to grow rather than remain static. She paused, looking around at the group of people who had somehow become a chosen family through the crucible of revealed secrets and complicated forgiveness. To the Morrison-Chen family, Emma concluded, may we always choose truth, even when it's harder than lies. The toast was echoed with enthusiasm around the table, but Margaret noticed how naturally Emma had included David's family name alongside theirs. They were no longer just the Morrisons dealing with the consequences of secrets. They were a blended family that had emerged from crisis stronger and more authentic. As they cleared the dishes and prepared for the afternoon portion of their celebration, Margaret found herself in the kitchen with the other mothers, Sarah, Lily, and even Grace, who had never had children but had mothered Robert and his family in her own sharp-tongued way. I keep expecting to wake up and discover this is too good to be true, Margaret confided. That family harmony built on honesty is just another kind of performance. Maybe it is, sometimes, Lily said thoughtfully. But performance based on truth is different from performance based on lies. When you're performing honesty, you're still being authentic. Sarah, who had spent years managing family secrets and smoothing over tensions, smiled at this observation. I never realized how exhausting it was to maintain family peace by avoiding difficult topics. This kind of peace, where we can talk about anything, feels so much more sustainable. Grace, who had been listening to this conversation while drying dishes, finally spoke. The thing about authentic relationships is that they can handle reality. They can survive someone having a bad day or making a mistake or revealing something complicated about their past. Relationships built on illusions fall apart the moment reality intrudes. Outside, they could hear laughter from the backyard, where 3 generations of their expanded family were playing an elaborate game of croquet that had devolved into friendly chaos. Michael was teaching Daniel some technique while Robert offered strategic advice to Jessica. David and James were debating the rules with the kind of competitive intensity that suggested they were becoming genuinely comfortable with each other. "Look at them," Margaret said, gesturing toward the window. 6 months ago, James wouldn't speak to David. Now they're arguing about croquet rules like old friends. James told me he realized that hating David was really about hating the complexity David represented, Sarah said. Once he accepted that love and family could be complicated without being diminished, David stopped being a threat and started being just another person to potentially care about. As the afternoon wound down, the extended family began the process of leave-taking that had become its own ritual. Hugs were exchanged, plans were made for future gatherings, and promises were extracted from various family members to stay in touch throughout the week. David and Lily were among the last to leave, their teenagers having bonded with Michael's art student friends and Sarah's children in the way that suggested ongoing relationships rather than polite one-time meetings. "Thank you," David said to Margaret as they stood in her doorway, "for welcoming us, for sharing Michael, for building something beautiful out of what could have been just destruction." Margaret looked at this man who had loved her 25 years ago, who had helped create her youngest son, who had rebuilt his life with grace and integrity after their affair ended. She no longer felt the sharp attraction that had once drawn her to him, but she felt something deeper: respect, affection, and gratitude for the way he had handled the complicated situation they'd all found themselves in. "Thank you for being the kind of man Michael can be proud to know," Margaret replied, "for building a family he can love being part of." As David's car disappeared down the street, Margaret returned to her dining room, where Robert was stacking chairs and humming contentedly. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting everything in the golden glow that photographers called magic hour. "Good day?" Robert asked, pausing in his work to study his wife's face. "Perfect day," Margaret replied, and meant it completely. "Different from what I expected perfect to look like, but perfect nonetheless." Robert nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. They had both learned that perfection was not the absence of problems, but the presence of love, strong enough to handle whatever problems arose. "What are you thinking about?" Robert asked, joining Margaret at the window where she was watching the sunset paint their neighborhood in shades of gold and amber. "I'm thinking about next year," Margaret said. "About how we'll probably have even more people around this table. Jessica will be home from college, maybe bringing a boyfriend. James and Lisa might have news about starting their own family. Michael's art career will probably have taken him to new places, brought new people into his life." She paused, smiling at the prospect of their family continuing to expand and evolve. "I'm thinking about how we'll handle whatever complications arise, whatever new truths need to be told, whatever difficult conversations we'll need to have." Robert slipped his arm around his wife's waist, holding her close as they watched their neighborhood settle into evening peace. "We'll handle them the way we handled this year," he said. "Together, honestly, with as much love as we can manage." Margaret leaned into her husband's embrace, feeling the solid presence of the man who had chosen to love her despite knowing everything about her past, her mistakes, her capacity for both betrayal and redemption. "I love our complicated family," she said. "I love our honest family," Robert replied. Outside, spring was turning toward summer, and the Morrison-Chen family was looking forward to whatever truth the future might bring. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.